Could you tell me a little bit about what you wanted to investigate?
We are really interested in the intersection of literacy and oral language. And in one study that I did when I was a doctoral student, it was my dissertation study actually, I was interested in examining the intersection of cultural practices and linguistic practices. And what I mean by that is I wanted to see whether the way that parents spoke to their children was going to vary depending on their cultural orientation, the socialization goals, the beliefs they have about children's development. And what I found in this particular study I did in Boston with Central American mothers and Irish American mothers actually from South Boston. And the context that I chose was oral narratives, oral storytelling, because oral stories are super important for children's literacy development. So the way that children tell stories is linked to, for instance, children's reading comprehension, children's ability to write later on in terms of stories. So that's where the intersection of oral stories and literacy comes in. And what I found was that there were cultural patterns such that the Central American mothers tended to be very much of hands-off with their children. They asked very open-ended questions. They allowed the child to take control of the story more so than the Irish American mothers. And so what I wanted to do with this particular study, we wanted to see whether we would find similar patterns in with a different population. So we wanted to replicate it, and we also wanted to add a second narrative context, which was book sharing. And so what we did is we went to Lima, Peru, because I had contacts there, being Peruvian myself, and we recruited mothers and families who had finished college. So these were all highly educated mothers. And at that time in Peru, about 19% of the population had a college degree. So they were not representative of all Peru, right? But they were highly educated mothers, high middle income mothers. And so we recruited in New York a sample that was similar to the sample in Peru. And so what we found was basically the same things. In the oral storytelling context, Peruvian mothers tended to allow the child to take control of the story. In other words, the way that we interpreted that was that they acted more as an audience for the child, more so than co-constructed or co-narrated with the child. The New York moms tended to engage in that co-narration.
Could you explain the difference between oral storytelling and book sharing?
Yes. The oral stories is basically when parents and children are talking about past experiences. For example, in this particular context, we call that family reminiscing. So talking about what you did yesterday, what you did over the weekend, those kinds of prompts and conversations happen a lot in schools. Right? So children, when they're in pre-K, when they're in kindergarten, they are asked during circle time to share what they did over the weekend, for example. Later on in school, they're going to be asked to write about it, right? So those kinds of conversations tend to happen in the home during family meals, for example, during bedtime, during bath time. And so we wanted to see what kind of discourse or language are the mothers using with their children? How are they helping the children think about what is important to include in these stories? And then also, how are they helping them organize these elements? Right, and so that was what we did with the oral storytelling. With the book sharing, we had mothers and children share a wordless book. that is used a lot in narrative research. It's called Frog, Where Are You? And the reason why I chose a wordless book was because I wanted to be able to use it with a variety of families and variety of languages. So it's not only a book that has been used in narrative research, but also it is a book that allowed me to take it without translating it. And so it also allowed the natural storytelling styles to emerge without having the text there.
A little bit about the numbers in the samples. How many pairs in Peru?
We had, it was a small sample. We had 32 mothers in New York and 32 mothers in Peru, in Lima, Peru.
What did you and your colleagues find?
I think that the big punchline is that what I had found in the original study, right, we also replicated with the other sample, remembering that in the previous sample I only had the oral storytelling or the family reminiscing context. So Peruvian mothers tended, and I say tended because I read once, and I believe it's true, that culture is not a straitjacket, right? So culture is not going to make you do things, right? But there was a tendency, a significant tendency for Peruvian mothers to be in the oral storytelling context, be a little more, allow the child to take the role of the narrator. Whereas the New York moms tended to do this back and forth with the child. They tended to co-construct, to co-narrate with the child. In the context of the book sharing, interestingly, the New York moms tended to do the same thing. So go this back and forth. In the same way, for instance, that, that yesterday we saw a father and a daughter talking, they engaged in this back and forth a lot. The Peruvian mothers, and these children were a little younger, right? They were 3 to 5 years old. The Peruvian mothers in the book sharing tended to take on the role of the narrator. So for us, what that meant was that for the Peruvian mothers, about 70% of the mothers shifted roles between the two narrative contexts. So while they allowed the child to take the role of the main narrator in the oral storytelling context, they took on the role of the main narrator in the book sharing context, whereas 90% of the New York moms co-narrated, right? And so for us, the takeaway message is that, I mean, we know that in order for children to develop strong language skills, especially those language skills that are going to be important for literacy, children not only have to be immersed in a rich language environment, but they also have to have opportunities to use that language, right? And so in the book sharing context, what was so interesting for me was that when mothers took the role of a narrator only, right? So they told the story to the child. When they were done, right, they'd say, now you tell me the story. So they offered that opportunity to the child, but after they were done. So they still kept that very strict narrator role. I am the narrator, your responsibility as an audience is to listen to me, right? But now you're going to read me the story, right? Or share the story, and you're going to be the narrator, and my responsibility as an audience is to listen to you. So, I mean, the takeaway message for me is we need to support oral language in various contexts, right? I think that there is a lot of push, especially in the United States, to encourage book sharing with children, right? And I think that that's absolutely fantastic, and there is a lot of research that supports that book reading is super important. But I think that we also have to talk about oral storytelling and the importance that oral storytelling has. I've interviewed mothers, immigrant mothers living in New York, about the different ways in which they support children's literacy and language skills. And what they share with me is that they engage in these conversations during bedtime. So sometimes rather than read to them, their child says, can you please tell me a story? Can you tell me a story that when you were a little girl? and the mother cuddles with the child and says, okay. And so she tells a story. And we need to provide families with tips about how to make those experiences enriching for the child to support their literacy skills.
I wanted to clarify for our viewers again, there's not a right or wrong way. There are different ways. Is that not what you're
Yes, that's
suggesting?
exactly what I'm saying. There are different ways of sharing stories with children, of supporting children's language and literacy skills. But I think that for me, the magic formula is going to be provide a rich linguistic environment, but also allow the child to participate in whatever way you are going to do that, right? So back and forth is one way, but then switching roles is another way, right? We know that from bilingual studies, right? We know that yes, being exposed to a second language is super important, but if the child does not have the opportunities to use that language, the child won't develop that second language. And it's the same for first language, I think.
Do you have some additional tips or behavioral changes or things parents can think about while they're having that story time or that storytelling time?
I think it's thinking about the stories that you're going to share, right? I think something that the child is going to be interested in. I think children, once they like the story, they're going to ask you to tell the story multiple times. And I think that you should acquiesce. So I think that you should tell the story multiple times. I think that when you're sharing the story with the child, if you adopt I am the narrator, you are the audience style, after you tell the story, you can talk with the child and say, what was the part that you liked the most? What would you have done in this case? Or let's think about a different ending, or close your eyes and tell me everything that you remember from the story. I mean, so allow the child to reflect upon the story, right? And so that there is that little exchange.
Building upon this research that you did, can you tell me just a little bit about that and how that fits in to this particular study?
Margaret Casp, she was my doctoral student, and for her dissertation, what she wanted to do is to see whether she focused only on the book sharing, and she wanted to see what were the relations between what mothers were doing, and in this case, we were all Latino mothers, 73 Latino mothers, most of them here in New York, immigrant mothers from Mexico and from the Dominican Republic. And she gave them Frog, Where Are You? To them and asked them to share the book with her child as they normally would. And then about 6 months later, she collected child outcome data, language and literacy data. And what she found was that there was two storyteller styles. So two styles where mothers took on the role of the narrator. One that had a lot of rich language, so they were longer, they were talking a lot. So their stories were longer. The other one, their stories were shorter, but they still took on the role of the narrator. And then the other one, she labeled them story builders labelers because they did this back and forth, but they focused on labeling. So if you remember what yesterday, what the dyad did, the father and the daughter, he asked a lot of open-ended and diverse questions. This particular group of mothers asked, what's this, what's that, and what's this, and what's that, as they were going through the book. So there was not a story like the story builder style, like what we saw, right? And what she found was that the children of the mothers who had provided the richer language, so the storytellers that talked a lot, had children with the best linguistic outcomes.
Is there anything I didn't ask you that you want to make sure that people know about this body of research?
I think that what's important is that we support families where they are. right? I think that oftentimes we want families to change what they're doing because they want what their children, we want to help them help their children succeed. And I think that the parents should be aware of what is their style, right? And then enrich that style more so than try to change that style.
If you could tell me where you did your undergraduate studies, advanced degrees.
I am originally from Lima, Peru. So I was born in South America, and I came to the United States when I was 18 to do my bachelor's degree. And I was a double major at Clark University in both psychology and Spanish language literature. Then after that, I went to Boston University to do my PhD in developmental psychology with a specific area, language development.